Hello everyone, I'm Priyadarshini Mara, faculty at the Department of Buddhist Studies, Delhi University. So today we're going to talk about Module 3, which is on inference. Inference forms an important part of Buddhist logic and epistemology. When we look at logic and epistemology, we see that Dignag plays an important role in forming the whole Buddhist philosophy as well as logical aspects and epistemological aspects. Dignag and other Buddhist scholars mentioned that right knowledge is of two kinds. One, perception, which is called pratyaksh. The second one is inference, and it is called anuman. The word man in the term anuman etymologically means that by which an object is measured. This is to say that man points out to that instrument which can correctly specify the nature of an object. However, the particle anu in the word anuman can be defined as subsequently or anantarya. This leads the term anuman to be equivalent in meaning to subsequent cognition. That correctly states inference is a form of knowledge that appears as belonging to the subject as well as the recollection of invariable concomitance between the reason and the inferable property, along with appearing subsequently to the perception of the reason. If a particular reason or probans, which is called hetu, is understood to possess these threefold characteristics. First, the reason or middle term must abide in the subject or the minor term. Second one is the reason must abide only in cases which are homologous. Third, the reason must not abide in cases which are heterologous. The fourth one states that it will invariably and unmistakably lead to the knowledge of the probandum. But what is the means of knowing that a particular probans would possess the triple characteristics? Dharmakirti, who's the contemporary of Dignag, says that only the following reasons, hetu, would satisfy these triple conditions. First, a reason which is identical in essence with the probandum, which is also called swabhav hetu. Second, which is an effect or product. And the third one is the non-perception. The second type of inference, known as pararthanuman, agrees with swarthanuman in all essential characteristics. The second type of inference, known as pararthanuman, agrees with swarthanuman in all essential characteristics. The main difference between the two, pararthanuman and swarthanuman, is that in the case of pararthanuman, the inferential process has to be put verbally in premises. Inference proceeds through the machinery of three terms. Now, what are these three terms? When we talk about the process of inference, we see that the subject, the predicate, which is also called probandum, and the probans play an important role in this process of inferring an object. There must also exist an invariable and unconditional relation between the probans and the probandum. Now, when we come to the objectivity of inference, so we can ask what is the objective and the proper matter of inference. This problem was attacked by Dignag in his text called Praman Samuchay. Dignag argues there are some logicians who think that the object of inference is the predicate I'll repeat it, that there are some logicians who think that the object of inference is the predicate. As we talked earlier, predicate can be called the probandum. So now, when inference is the object of predicate, which is invariably connected with the probands, others again think in the connection that is inferred and neither the subject nor the predicate, because they are known from other evidences. But both these views are untenable. If the probans is known to be invariably connected with the probandum, the latter is already known at the time the connection was apprehended. If it is contended that the predicate was not known as related to the subject, well, let then the subject thus qualified be regarded as the probandum. The connection too cannot be the subject matter of inference, but it does not contain the two terms, the proband and the probandum, in its fold like the subject. Akshpad, who is one more philosopher from the ancient times, enumerates 5 members or sentences as constitute a syllogism. So there are 5 members that are enumerated that a syllogism constitutes. They are: first, proposition, which is called pratigya; second, reason, which is called hetu; third, an explanatory example, which is called udharan; fourth, application, it is called upnaya; fifth, conclusion, and it is called nigamana. I'll repeat these constituting parts of syllogism again. The first one is called proposition or pratigya. The second one is called reason or hetu. The third one is called an explanatory example or udharan. The fourth one is called application or upnaya. And the fifth one states the conclusion or nigamana. So when we see that there is a proposition which states a particular thing, so for the proposition to be proved, there has to be a reason. This reason might stand alone or with certain other reasons. There has to be an explanatory example. So every proposition along with reasoning constitutes of an explanatory example which states the proposition to be true or false. Then this particular proposition along with reason and explanatory example has to be put into application. This application stands along with conclusion. At the end of the proposition, there has to be a conclusion. These sentences are not detached, unconnected statements, but on the other hand, they are closely knit together by mutual requirement and they form a coherent group or a complex judgment. So when we look at these 5 propositions or 5 constituents of a syllogism, they are related. All these 5 propositions need to be there with explanatory examples and reasoning, and thus they form the conclusion. There was a wide divergence of opinion regarding the number of premises, and Dharmakirti denied that the conclusion formed a part of the syllogism. So, when we look at these 5 constituent parts of a syllogism, it can be stated that Dharmakirti did not agree that conclusion formed a part of the syllogism. The whole syllogism with all its members fully stated amount to this. The first one, proposition is the statement of the thesis to be proved. When we look at the proposition, we consider it to be a statement of the thesis, and this needs to be proved. If we give an example, we see word is impermanent. Here, this stands for pratigya. So the example that we're using here is that word is impermanent. The second syllogism or the constituent of syllogism states that statement of reason consists in adducing a fact capable of proving the probandum. So when we look at the statement of reason, we state that it has to be capable of proving the probandum it's bringing up. For example, because word we are talking about here, so because it has a definite origin, therefore hetu comes into action here. So when we say that word is impermanent, the second one example that we give here is that because word has a definite origin. The third one states that example is a familiar instance which is known to possess the probandum by virtue of the probative reason. Therefore, what can be stated is this example, which is a familiar instance, it possesses probandum by the virtue of the probative reason. The fourth syllogism or the fourth constituent part of a syllogism states that which it possesses in common with the subject or the minor term. The proposition has to possess in common the subject or the minor term. For example, a thing having a definite origin is seen to be impermanent. As for instance, a pot. So this would be the udharan or the example. I repeat again, the example that a thing having a definite origin is seen to be impermanent. And the instance that we laying here is a pot, because the pot arises out of clay along with certain other conditions that bring it up, and then at the end you can bring the pot back to what it is, that is clay. Now the fifth one is the application of the reason to the subject after its probative value has been attested in the example. When we talk about the application of the reason to the subject after receiving its probative value, then the example that comes before us is that word has a definite origin, quite as much as the pot which is known to be impermanent. Now, when we look at the existential things around us, we see that they all have the characteristic of being impermanent, and that is the reason that we use a pot as an example here. So a word which has a definite origin, there is a definite origin quite as much as the pot, just like the pot has a definite origin as well as definite cessation. The same way, a word comes into existence and then ceases away. So this is Upanaya. Now when we get to the sixth part of the syllogism, we see that conclusion is the restatement of the thesis with the statement of reason attached to it. So when we look at conclusion, we see that the proposition which has been given in the beginning of a syllogism, conclusion is the restatement of that particular thesis, but what is attached to it is the reason. Now this reason states why a particular syllogism stands where it stands, or why a particular syllogism or a proposition is negated. Therefore, this understanding is very essential when we look at the constituents of a syllogism. When we talk about conclusion, the example that can be stated is that therefore word is impermanent because it has a definite origin. This is nigamana. So, why do we call a word to be impermanent even after it has a definite origin? It is because the existential phenomena is all impermanent. Anything that comes into existence has a definite impermanency attached to it, along with certain other factors like leading to suffering, and there is no identity or essence of that particular thing. So, the same way when we talk about a particular word, then although we can say that it has a definite origin, but what we cannot agree to or state is that it lives for eternity, because it does not. It stays for a certain time, but then it disappears. Hence, Dharmakirti is perhaps the first philosopher who questioned the cognancy of the proposition. So, when we look at the chronological order of the logicians, especially the Buddhist logicians, we see that Dignac propounded the logic and epistemology of Buddhism. Then Dharmakirti came up with a lot of understandings regarding logic and epistemology. Dharmakirti is perhaps the first philosopher who questioned the cognancy of this proposition. A proposition has no probative value. The conclusion is proved by virtue of the second and third, or the third and fourth members. The fourth and the second members being identical in import. Therefore, what Dharmakirti has to say is that a proposition has no probative value. Why does a proposition has no probative value? Because the conclusion which states a proposition to be existing or not existing, to be true or not true, to be proved or not proved. So, this conclusion, by virtue of the second and third, or the third and fourth members, stands. It cannot stand without the help of these other categories. The fourth and the second member being identical in import. So, what we are trying to imply is that the fourth and the second members are identical. Therefore, what Dharmakirti wanted to state is that the fourth and second member being identical could be replaced, and we could do with just one member. These two members are alone relevant, and the conclusion too follows irresistibly from these two, and as such need not be stated in so many words. Therefore, what he was trying to state is that we do not require so many constituents of a syllogism for a proposition to exist and to be along with the conclusion stated. It does not require so many members as the constituent terms. A statement is necessary when a fact cannot be known otherwise, and it is redundant here as the fact is known from the drift of two members. So when we look at a statement, the necessary condition is that if the fact cannot be known otherwise. But here we see that from the drift of these two members, the fact is already known. Hence, we do not require so many constituent parts of a syllogism. Moreover, the conclusion is only an inane and useless repetition of the thesis. I want to mention that this is the view of Dharmakirti. He states that the conclusion is only an inane and useless repetition of the thesis. So, he does not approve of a conclusion in a syllogism because he states that it is merely a repetition. of what is already being told, and so should be expunged. But even the thesis by itself, without any reference to the conclusion, is redundant. Now, if we want to counterattack Dharmakirti, this can be stated that a thesis by itself, without any reference to the conclusion, is redundant. Why? Because the subject of the dispute is an accepted datum and is known from the context. Therefore, what can be stated is that context holds an important part and accepted datum and is known. Every action is or every proposition or a syllogism is known considering the context in which it is being spoken of. The Buddhist therefore reduces the syllogism to two members. The Buddhists therefore reduce the syllogisms to two members, the universal proposition with the example tagged on and the minor premise. So when we look at the Buddhist, they reduce the syllogisms into universal propositions along with the example and minor premise. In the Buddhist syllogism, as propounded by Dignac and Dharmakirti, the psychological factors were carefully eliminated and the syllogism received a perfectly logical shape. Now, when we look at inference, what holds importance is something called Vyapti. What is Vyapti? Vyapti is the inseparable connection. It is the nerve of inference. Inference is the knowledge of objects through the apprehension or understanding of some mark, also called link. So, when we look at inference, we can say that it is the apprehension of understanding of certain mark, and this mark is called link, and this mark is invariably related to the inferred object. Now this inferred object is termed as sadhya. The invariable relation between the two, Vyapti, is called inference, and this invariable relation between the link or the mark and the inferred object, which is the sadhya, leads one to attain Vyapti or the nerve of inference. Vyapti has three characteristics. The first one is Paksh. It is the minor term about which we infer something. The second one is Sadhya or the major term, which is the inferred object. The third one is Ling or Sadhan or the middle term, which is related to the major term and is also present in the minor term. The three characteristics of Vyapti are to be repeated for the understanding. So the first one is Paksh or the minor term about which we infer something. The second is Sadhya or the major term, which is the inferred object. The third one is Ling or Sadhan or the middle term, which is related to the major term and it's also present in the minor term. So now the example that we use in order to state these three characteristics is, suppose the hill is fiery because it smokes and whatever smokes is fiery. I repeat the example again. The hill is fiery because it smokes and whatever smokes is fiery. Here, hill is Paksh, fiery is Sadhya and smoke is Ling. So, when we look at this example that the hill is fiery, we can say that hill is that Paksh or the major term. Fiery is the Sadhya and smoke is the link. So why do we call smoke link? Because it is that mark through which we infer that the hill has fire. We pass from the perception of smoke in the hill to the knowledge of existence of fire in it. On the ground of our previous knowledge of the universal relation between smoke and fire. If we look into the storehouse of memory, which is also called Alya Vinyan, we see that there are certain instances and experiences that are saved in our memory. These experiences we relate to our present understanding of a particular thing. So, on the ground of our previous knowledge, it can be stated that the universal relation between smoke and fire can be gained. Our previous knowledge that anything which has smoke coming out needs to have fire can be applied at the time when we see that smoke is coming out of a hill. We infer that the hill must be on fire in order for the smoke to be coming out of the hill. Therefore, we can infer the existence of fire from the existence of smoke in all places and times, only if we can persuade ourselves by unflinching logic that smoke cannot exist without fire. But what is the guarantee that the smoke and fire will be associated together without any break? Now, when we look at this example of smoke and fire, we state that wherever there is smoke, there is fire. But when the critics objected, they stated that what guarantee is it that smoke and fire will go together or can be associated together? We cannot certainly arrive at this truth from perceptual observation because the entire individual cases of fire and smoke, present, past and future, near and distant, are not amenable to observation, and even if it had been possible, it would have rendered all inferences negatory. The Buddhist logicians base this knowledge of invariable concomitance on the principle of causality. So, when we see this problem of invariable concomitance or this knowledge of invariable concomitance, which is dependent, for example, on smoke and fire, that they go hand in hand, and where there is smoke, there is fire, we see that the Buddhist logicians are bringing in the notion of causality. Now, before we get into what is inference related to causality or how is inference related to causality, we need to know what is causality according to Buddhism. Buddhists believe that every cause has an effect and every effect has a cause. So, the things that exist in the phenomena are not without any cause. They are conditioned by various other causes. So the origin, the development, the sustenance, and also the dissolution of every existence is based on the theory of cause and effect and lot of other conditions that give rise to it and that sustains it and that ceases its existence. If two things are related as cause and effect, we know they are universally related because the effect cannot arise without a cause, and where there is a cause, there will be its effect. So, when we look at the causal relationship, we can state that the effect cannot arise without a cause, and where there is a cause, there will be its effect. So, these two, the relationship of cause and effect, cannot be disassociated in any way. To determine the causal relation between them, Buddhists adopt the method of Panchkarani. Panchkarani is stated as follows: neither the cause nor the effect is perceived. So, when we look at the cause or when we look at the effect, they are both interrelated. We cannot talk about an effect without its cause, or we cannot talk about the cause not giving rise to any effect. So, if there is no cause, the effect is also not perceived. The second proposition of Panchkarani is the cause is perceived. And the third one is immediately the effect is perceived. So when we look at these propositions, so the first one stands alone in the sense that if cause cannot be seen, then effect cannot be seen as well. The second and third are to be taken together. The second one, which states that cause is perceived, immediately the third one states that the effect is perceived. So what we're trying to state here is that the moment the cause comes into perception, its effect also comes into perception. The fourth proposition says that the cause disappears, and the fifth one states that immediately the effect disappears. So now when we look at the five propositions of Panchkarani, we see that the first one has its own conclusion. The second and third are to be related together, and likewise fourth and fifth are to be related together. The fourth and fifth one states that cause disappears. Immediately the effect disappears. The cause disappears and immediately the effect disappears as well. So you can state that neither the cause nor the effect is perceived. So if there is no cause, there is no effect. The cause is perceived, immediately the effect is perceived. So if the cause comes into existence, then also its effect is seen. And the moment a cause disappears, immediately the effect disappears. So that moment when the cause disappears, the effect also ceases to exist. Now, if you see into the relationship of cause and effect, it can be stated that the cause gives rise to a particular effect. Now, that very particular effect becomes the cause for the next effect. So, there's this relationship between cause and effect which is unending. Inference is an indirect source of knowledge when it serves to correct illusion. Inference is indirect source of knowledge, especially when it serves to correct illusion. It has to be remembered that when it serves to correct illusion. Dharmakirti says, sensation does not convince anybody. If it cognizes something, it does it in the way of a passive reflex, not in the way of judgment. So, when we talk about sensation, according to Dharmakirti, it cannot cognize something. It cognizes something not as a judgment, but as a passive reflex. So, there's a particular instance where you come in contact with the object and then there's a passive reflex that gives rise to inference. So, judgment does not play a particular role here when we talk about inference unless it is the end part or the conclusive part. In that part in which sensation has the power to engender the following right judgment, in that part only does it assume the dignity of right knowledge. But in that part in which it is powerless to do it, owing to the causes of error, another source of knowledge begins to operate. So when we look at sensations, we are stating that they don't have the power to become a judgment. They act only as passive reflexes. So, owing to the causes of error is the reason another source of knowledge begins to operate along with sensation. There is another source of knowledge that comes into existence or action. This brushes away all wrong imagination, and thus we have another source which is inference, which then comes to the fore. So when we look at something coming to the front along with sensation, we term sensation not to be a judgment. So what is that another source of knowledge that comes to the light and that's playing the role? It is inference that is playing that particular role. Now, for Dignac and his followers, the validity of inference is only on the phenomenal plane. Inference has no reference to ultimate reality, which is indescribable and beyond all thought determinations. So, when we look at existence, we divide it into two phases. One is the ultimate, which is the attainment of liberation or nirvana, and second one is the empirical. Empirical is also called samvriti. Samvriti is that plane where existence plays a prominent role. So, this phenomenal plane is impermanent, it is full of suffering and has no essence of its own. It is swabhav shunya. When we talk about inference, we say that it can be talked of only in the phenomenal plane, but not at the level of ultimate reality. Why cannot inference be talked about at the level of ultimate reality? Because nirvana is that ultimate reality which lies beyond the phenomenal plane, and nirvana cannot be described or ascribed into a particular definition, or it cannot be situated under a particular realm. Therefore, only adjectives are used to define it or to place a particular instance onto nirvana. But when you come to the phenomenal existence, then inference plays a major role. According to Buddhism, there are only two sources of valid knowledge, and it is perception, which is pratyaksh, and inference, which is anuman. So here, when we're talking about inference, we can say that all our experiences are based and our knowledge of the presence is based on inference. So when we infer a particular thing, we get back to our storehouse memory where we have stored all our past experiences. We try to relate it to what we are perceiving at present, and then building up on that particular relationship, we come up with a inference. Inference has no reference. This whole business of probans and probandum, observes Dignac, depends on the relation of quality and the possessor of quality, a relation which is imposed by thought, and it has no reference to an external existence and non-existence. So now here, when we see Dignac, he states that the relation of quality and possessor of quality plays an important role when we talk about inference, because this relation is imposed by thought and it has no reference to an external existence. If there is something that you perceive, you get back to your experiences, to your thought processes, and then the mind functions in such a way in drawing that relationship between what you have perceived and between what you have experienced. And this brings out the inference without any reference to what lies externally or what does not lie externally. All these must be properly ascertained. So, these conditions are necessary to be kept in mind while we're talking about inference. All these characteristics are to be accepted when they are properly ascertained by one's own self through the instrument of valid knowledge. So, when we look at these characteristics, they are to be properly ascertained by one's own self, and this can be done through the use of valid knowledge. This valid knowledge is, according to Buddhism, gained through perception and inference. Inference plays a major role in bringing out valid knowledge. When we look at other schools of philosophical thought, they have many other sources of valid knowledge. But according to Buddhism, the only source of valid knowledge is this inference along with perception. So our perception sometimes use or require inference in order to bring up a particular judgment or in order to present a particular syllogism. So when we talk about inference, it is majorly based on our past experience. We cannot infer about a particular thing without having any experience of it. And concomitance, or the invariable relationship between the reason and the inferable property, plays a major role in inferring a particular instance or knowledge. So this knowledge that is acquired through Pararthanuman or Swarthanuman is the valid source of knowledge or is the valid knowledge. And as we talked about it earlier, Vyapti or inferable concomitance plays an important role in giving out valid knowledge. Vyapti, which is the nerve of inference, is based on certain other characteristics for its existence, and these characteristics together form the inference which gives us knowledge. Dharmakirti talks about two members alone relevant, and the conclusion too follows. Therefore, according to different philosophers, there are a variety of knowledge or logical aspects that come into existence. Therefore, to conclude, we can state that inference is a form of knowledge that appears as belonging to the subject as well as the recollection of invariable concomitance between reason and the inferable property, along with appearing subsequently to the perception of the reason. Hence, according to Buddhism, the Buddhist logicians, and according to Buddhist epistemology, it is stated that inference is the valid source of knowledge, which is called pramad, and it gives the valid knowledge to an individual. Therefore, talking about inference, it plays a major role in perceiving in our phenomenal existence, in whatever our understanding of phenomena is. And along with inference, we will see that perception also forms a major role in perceiving the entire phenomenal existence. Therefore, inference and perception together make the valid source of knowledge and provide valid knowledge at empirical level. When we talk about valid knowledge, we mean the empirically valid knowledge, but this cannot be ascribed to the absolute, which is the state of nirvana.